While the alternative title, A Hyperrealistic Portrait, has been used and probably misused on this channel a couple of times, today's painting doesn't have an actual title of its own. I painted it, stayed with it in the studio for over a year, exhibited and sold it, and time has passed since then, and I'm yet to settle on a title for this painting. So what you're going to be watching today is my process of painting a hyper-realistic portrait of a woman with milk dripping down her face. And the background is dark and the woman is black and the milk is white, so there's some contrast there, and light is hitting her from the side, and you can almost touch the texture of her skin because it's so detailed. The process begins with a rectangular grid drawn across the face of the canvas, and I'll explain why my canvas is brown as opposed to white and how exactly the grid works. But as soon as I'm done drawing it, I then mix whatever oil paints I have lying around with some white to create a kind of bright color. Then I add to that solvent. In this case I'm using kerosene, but other alternatives could be turpentine, Gemsol or Tapenoid, the latter two being the healthier options. Then I'm going to mix this into a runny paste, but not too runny or too liquid that when I paint with it on canvas it flows down. I'll then use a small or medium brush to paint the outlines of my figure, and at this stage I can now talk about why my canvas is colored and how exactly I use the grid. The reason why my canvas is brown and not white is because I find that when I paint on white canvas, I tend to underestimate just how dark things should be, and so the paintings end up looking brighter than I want. And of course the inverse is true, in that if the canvas was black, I would end up with a painting that's darker than I wanted it to be, and so a neutral color like the one I have here is just perfect for me. The type of paint I use for that is acrylic, although silk vinyl could do a similar job. And as for the grid, there's a similar grid on the reference image which I'm simply transferring onto the canvas. And what I'm painting right now are the contours or the main lines that separate different colors in the reference image. And so that's what I'm transferring onto my canvas in this stage. Remember, the smaller the rectangles or the size of the grids, the more accurate the outlines are going to be. But at this stage, they don't have to be accurate, because if I find that I'm way off of how I wanted it to be, I can always add new grids or new outlines and make the corrections in the latter stages. I'll then get rid of the chalk so that I'm left with nothing but the outlines, and then it will be time to move on to the underpainting. For the underpainting, which is also done in acrylics, I'm going to need a different set of brushes. These are going to be harder brushes than the ones I use for oils, and so the water that I've added is just to soften them up a bit, and I'm going to use the canvas that I lay underneath them as my palette. After this, I'll now create a gradient that flows from dark to light using these acrylic paints. And the darkest color here won't be black, nor will the lightest color be white. And this is so that in the final layer, if and when I'll be using those extreme colors, it will be very easy for me to differentiate between the parts of the underpainting which I have painted on and those that I haven't painted on with oil paints. It's also better to make the underpainting using colors that won't appear in the final layer. So if the painting is going to have something like a brownish feel, it's better to use an underpainting of, say, a blue or a purple gradient. Alternatively, if the underpainting is going to have similar colors to those of the final painting, then just try to avoid the extremes, in this case black and white. Also, acrylic paint sometimes collects in lumps depending on how you apply it. So before the underpainting dries, I check it again just to make sure I've gotten rid of any of those lumps or even bristles that may have come off during application and stuck to the canvas. With the underpainting done, I can now get on to painting this lady, and I'm going to start with the background. The background is really dark, and the darkest color that I tend to use in my paintings is burnt umber and not black, unless I'm painting something like a grayscale painting. I'm going to apply this paint straight as it comes from the tube without mixing it with any medium or solvent, because I don't want it to be runny like I did earlier when I was painting the outlines. Burnt umber also dries pretty fast, at least compared to other oil colors. And by fast in this case, I mean in under 24 hours. So before it starts to dry, I take the brush I was using to paint, or even a bigger or a softer one, and try to even out the texture of the paint so that the brush strokes don't show in the different directions I was applying them in. With that done, I can now start mixing up the colors that are going to form the skin tone of the model. And as you can see, with a pretty small array of colors, you can mix up any skin tone you want. I tend to organize all my palettes in gradients, so it's easy for me to know where in the palette I'm supposed to pick paint when I'm moving from one part of the painting to another. As you can see to the left of the painting, the background, which I smoothed earlier, has dried into a really smooth finish that doesn't show any brush strokes, just as I wanted it. But back to painting the model, I'm going to start with something called a local color. So this is going to be the skin color of this lady before light interferes with it. So that is the color or the combination of colors that are in the middle of my palette. As opposed to how I did the background, this time I'm going to need these colors to be a bit runny, because I need a translucent and not an opaque finish. So I'm applying them by mixing them with a bit of solvent, so that when I paint it on canvas, you can see the underpainting underneath what I'm painting right now, which is the whole point of the underpainting. Its purpose is to guide me in the next stage. So I need to be able to see it, even if I'm only seeing it faintly. And mixing oil paint with a bit of solvent allows me to achieve that translucent layer. And after doing the same with the lips, in this case I can move on to either the shadows or the highlights of the face. And I'm going to start with the highlights for this painting. These aren't the final highlights, as you'll see. These are only to guide me again in the next step. So with each step I cover the underpainting more and more until I get to a point where it's no longer visible. Now that doesn't take a lot of work. So after applying these highlights and smoothing them so they look a bit hazy or cloudy, I'm going to do the same with shadows. Then after the shadows, no underpainting will be visible, and I shall have replaced it with a oil underpainting, if you want to call it that. And so then I can move on to the more detailed shadows and highlights and textures and other things that are on this lady's face. There could be some highlights that stand out more than others, or some reflections, or some parts that are just extra dark or extra bright. So I'm going to apply those in this stage. Again, not in too much detail, because the point of this stage is for it to guide the next one, in which I'm going to use the small brushes and paint all the details. And so using these medium and big brushes allows me to cover a lot of ground and not obsess too much with details that I don't need at this stage. And after giving this stage a couple of days to dry, I can now come back and paint the final details. This is also a good time to talk about one of my favorite things about oil paints, which is they take quite long to dry. So in this case, we're talking about 3 or 4 days after the previous process. And as you can tell, the colors that I mixed have dried on the surface, but the ones that I used to mix them haven't dried yet. I don't know the science behind that, but it's definitely something quite interesting. But what I like about oil paints is that even after a couple of days out in the natural environment, you can always come back and peel off the upper layer of these colors, and under this dried coat you'll find usable oil paint in perfect condition. But that said, there are better ways of keeping oil paints from drying for even longer periods of time. I sometimes keep them in the refrigerator or in the freezer. If, say, I'm in the middle of a painting and I need to leave the studio, maybe to travel for a few days, then come back and resume the painting where I left it off. Keeping them in the freezer is a good idea for that. But for the most part, even if you leave them out in the natural environment, unless it's not out in the sun, you're not going to have similar problems to what you normally have with acrylics, whereby they dry in just a matter of minutes. And so after isolating these usable oil paints and getting rid of the dried coats, I'll mix up a bit more of these colors, then proceed to select the brushes I'll use for the next stage of this painting, which is creating the detailed shadows. The paint is relatively dry and thick at this stage. Again, I'm not mixing it with any medium or solvent before application, and this allows me to create soft shadows when I want to without the edges of these colors being visible as they would be if the paint was mixed, especially with medium. The brushes I use for this stage are also relatively tough, at least compared to the brushes that I would use if I was painting, say, a watercolor painting. And this is because when rubbing the paint on canvas in this way, the brushes tend to lose their edge, and you may even lose some bristles with time due to the friction. So it's important to have brushes that can withstand a lot of action of this sort, so that I don't have to replace brushes every so often. As is the case with a lot of my processes, at least in this particular painting, each stage is designed to guide the next one. So even with the shadows, you can see I started by painting them using a sort of muted version of burnt umber. Then later on, I come in with the actual burnt umber and paint in the darkest parts of the shadows, following what I'd painted before. And sometimes I also use my fingers to smoothen the transitions between these different colors. As you can tell as well, the advantage of not having painted this face in one sitting is that since I'm working on a background layer that's now dry, the application of this new layer of paint doesn't at all interfere with the previous layer. And that layer is now acting as a guide to the final layer in the same way that the original acrylic underpainting was to this layer. That underpainting is now fully covered, and all it took was just a couple of runs with the local color, the shadows, and the midtones. And now that I'm done with the shadows, it's time to paint the midtones, then the highlights. But before I do that, there's one visual correction that needs to be made. If you look at this painting now, you can see that some sections have dried into a dull finish or a matte finish, while others have dried into a shiny or a gloss finish. This is going to be a problem for the next layer because I won't be able to accurately describe the actual colors underneath. And so before I move on to the midtones, I'm gonna need to create something that can be called an isolation layer. I'll paint this in using linseed oil, and it will even out the luster or the reflectiveness of the entire canvas. And of course, I'm applying this isolation layer after leaving the shadows to dry completely after a couple of days, after which it's now a good time to move on to the midtones. These are going to be the sections of this portrait that have a medium amount of light hitting them, but that doesn't mean those are the only sections that I'm going to cover with this color. It's going to go over all the lead sections of this lady's face, including where the highlights are going to be. And that's because the highlights themselves are generally a part of the midtones. So these are going to be the tips of, say, the pimples or the wrinkles or just the natural bumps on a skin. The difference this is going to make is barely visible at this stage. But what I'm doing here is I'm finding those gullies that I painted with the shadows and painting in the raised parts that will make them look three-dimensional. And then later on, for the sections that are going to be receiving light at something close to a perpendicular angle, I'm going to add in the highlights. So these are going to be very sparingly added later on. So now you can start to see the difference between the highlights and the midtones. The highlights are the ones that make more of a difference. This entire process of painting these highlights is going to take at least a day. And even though there's milk pouring down our face, I'm going to avoid painting in the highlights of those streams of milk just yet, because milk is white and opaque. And so for its highlights, I'm going to mix a different color as opposed to water, which being transparent would have allowed me to use the same colors for the highlights of the skin and of the water droplets themselves, except for the reflections of light on the individual droplets, which would have then been probably white or whatever color the light would have been. While for the shadows, I normally start with the not so dark shadows, then finally move on to the darkest ones. When it comes to the midtones and the highlights, it's the inverse of that process. So I'll start with the not so bright ones, then finally paint in the brightest colors. And for most of my portraits, white tends to be the final color that I'll paint. Finally, we get to painting the milk itself, and as you can tell, the color is now something close to gray as opposed to the highlights of the skin, which were kind of cream or kind of brownish. And it's only for the tips of these droplets where they're reflecting light from the source that I'm going to paint the white highlights. Of course, in some sections, the details are a bit blurred, and in others, they are much more in focus. So for the blurred areas, as you can see, I'm using bigger brushes and painting them in something of circular motions. And again, sometimes I may even use my fingers to create this blurry or this cloudy effect. This isn't easy on the brushes, so after a lot of such paintings, I normally need to replenish my stock. But I also very rarely get rid of old brushes because they usually come in handy at one stage or the other in future. But back to the painting, it's now starting to look more and more like milk with each grey stream or droplet. Next up, I'll paint some of the hair that's visible from the shadows, and afterwards the bigger followed by the smaller droplets of milk that are clinging to the hair. And for the hair, you can see the effect is different in that the lines look like they've been drawn using pen. And this is because this time I'm mixing the paint with some solvents like I did earlier when I was painting the outlines. And so next up, I'll move on to just a few final highlights using white itself. And as you can tell, I tend to use pure white very sparingly because its effect tends to be more potent that way. And now is when it's starting to look a bit closer to a hyperrealistic portrait. One thing I enjoy about this style is that it's normally really easy to see the contrast between textures. Like in this case, you can see and almost feel the relative roughness of her skin texture, especially when juxtaposed next to the almost believably fluid streams of milk flowing down her face. And with this final application of the highlights done, I can now present a complete painting that still has no title even at the time of recording. So if you have a suggestion about what I can call this painting, feel free to leave it in the comments. But until then, I hope it lived up to the hype of being a hyper-realistic portrait of a woman with milk flowing down her face.